driving this morning over here, and the shadows from the trees across the road were just pronounced. I think it's this time of year, it's a little earlier in the sun rotation. They were just magnificent, magnificent. Got to thinking about shadows. Shadows are a representative of what's real. Shadows coming across the road were from real trees. Sometimes shadows can offer protection or refuge from heat. When no trees are there across the road, there's this blaze of sunshine that comes across and no shadow at all. Making a transition from there, we're studying the book of Esther. And I've called this study God in the Shadows. Because God is not mentioned at all in Esther, but he's there. We need to become far more aware and trusting in the fact that God is in our lives. He's working in the affairs of this world intimately. Many times we don't think about that because we don't see it, but we see the shadow. And wherever I am, there's a shadow that's cast, and God is in the shadow. In our study of Esther, we'll be here for a couple of weeks. We're putting Esther in an historical context. And I believe today our church needs to understand the historical context in which we exist. We don't need to ignore the affairs going on around us, no matter what they are, because God is working in all of that, even though we don't see it. God has opened the door for us, and he says, you can walk through this door if you want to. Do you want to? And therein lies the challenge, because I have to step through that door. Many times things are not obvious. I don't see God working. And so I want us to learn these lessons in the picture and be very encouraged what God is doing for us today. Our text is the book of Esther. Bibles in front of you and on the pew, that would be page 396 if you want to turn there, because we'll be reading text as we speak. I'll repeat some of the things that we've already said in light of the historical context. So suffer with me a bit, because that's what it takes to make it real and put it in a place and time. Judah went into Babylonian captivity 3 times, 605, 597, and 586 BC. Cyrus, the king of Persia, in 539 BC, conquered Babylon, took them over. And the captives and the exiles that were in Babylon were transferred 200 miles farther away to the capital, to Persia, but to the capital of Susa, which was the Medo-Persian capital. In 536, Cyrus sent the captives back to Jerusalem. Exile was over. Captivity was over. Jeremiah 29:10 says that you will be in captivity or in exile for 70 years. And Cyrus sent them back, that was over. We see God working in these ways, even though we don't hear him mentioned. God is not mentioned as a force. God is not mentioned and said to be God with us, or God doing this, or God is here. And yet we see God raising up people to be his force. The significance of Esther is we see God working in the shadows, raising up people to be his force, because there were some things that had to be accomplished that he said would be accomplished. The temple needed to be rebuilt because Nebuchadnezzar had burned it to the ground. In Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 to 11, Cyrus sends Ezra back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Doesn't say God did it, said Cyrus did it. God in the shadows. In Ezra 4, 6, and 7, the temple is rebuilt. Doesn't say God did it. Cyrus sent Ezra and his Jewish brothers and sisters back to Jerusalem to do it. There were over 42,000 that went back. Not everybody did. Some stayed. But there were things yet to be done. The God of this world was going to try to annihilate by genocide every Jew that lived. They had to be protected. The wall still needs to be rebuilt around Jerusalem. Hadn't been done yet. Funding had to be provided to do the job. Hadn't been given yet. Xerxes needs to die. He's the Ahasuerus in Ezra chapter 1. He needs to die. They're 900 miles away. And how will all this happen? That's the book of Esther. The characters in Esther: Xerxes, Vashti, all the beautiful young women in the Persian kingdom, Haggai, Mordecai, Hadassah, or Esther, and Haman. I'll remind us that in the book of Esther, these things will be highlighted. They'll be highlighted and dealt with. Legislated sexism, racism, attempted destruction of the people, genocide, fake news, politics, political spin, political irony, political personality, political advisors, governmental power, women's leadership, personal ambition over others, war, national debt, the power of a nation, the future of a nation, and God's not mentioned at all. That's got to be some study, don't you think? No different than the society that we live in today. In Esther chapter 1, actually, I'll read the scripture first before we start there. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58. Jot this down. It needs to be a key scripture in your reading. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. When everything is moving against them, when nothing looks like it's being accomplished, when there's major mechanical tractors in the parking lot and we can't even come into our own building to worship by parking somewhere else, still need to be about working Lord's work, right? Still need to be doing, because our work is not in vain. That's Esther. Our work is not in vain. In Esther chapter 1, Ahasuerus has a 6 months party. Ahasuerus is also called Xerxes. He's putting together an alliance, mercenaries, because he's about to attack Greece. And he does so for 6 months, 180 days. He wines and dines, puts together his troops. Between Esther chapter 1 and chapter 2, he goes against Greece. 3 major battles: Thermopylae, Hell's Gates, Salamis, the great water naval victory of battle, and the Battle of Plataea, the plains of Plataea. The Greeks beat him bad. And after the Battle of Plataea, he limped back to Susa. Most of his army had either been killed, died of disease, or hunger. Esther chapter 2, when he comes back, he's a beaten fellow. He's a king that has no reputation. He's a king that's been soundly routed. And you live in Susa. What do you think the newspapers are saying? What's going on? What's going on in society? How are we going to deal with this? The treasury has been routed as well. He spent megabucks on paying the mercenaries to go against Greece. He comes back. And Esther chapter 2 says, after these things, it's been 4 years has been gone. Now, in review, Esther chapter 1, during this time, his queen was Vashti. He called Vashti out, said, come out loud. I want you to entertain. I want everybody to look at you. You're a beautiful woman. Come on out. I want everybody to see you, put you on display. She wouldn't do it. Made him angry. Had to pass a law to prevent such things. You can go back and read chapter 1 to read some of that. So he comes back and he's thinking about Vashti, 4 years being gone. Kingdom seems to be in ruins, if you will. He's thinking about Vashti, but he had written a law. She could never come in his presence again. And it says, in verse 2, then the king's young men, his advisors who attended him, said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem of Susa, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given to them. Let the young women who please the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. You know, I think about politics today and the things that happen and the spin that happens. Because when Xerxes comes back, it's a different world. We need a new queen. I don't know. The text doesn't say if this was a diversion, if it was a strategy, if it was taking the pressure off of the extreme failure that he had just experienced and putting it somewhere else. Happens today. Spin, the shifting, the strategy, the tactics. Whatever the motives were, God has to be in the shadows here. Whatever it looks like, whatever the press is saying, whatever it appears to be going on, God has to be involved. That's the lesson of Esther. That's what we're building. So the process is go out and gather all the beautiful young virgins and bring them in. They essentially says, go out and capture them. They don't have a choice. This is what the king is doing. We do it. There's no vote being taken. There's no protest that's allowed. Go get it. Where's God now? The theme of what we'll study today is the power and presence of the women of God in his providence. The power and presence of the women of God in his providence. On verse 5, we begin to see how God has put this together. There was a Jew in Susa, the citadel. His name was Mordecai. He was Esther's cousin. Esther's mom and dad had died. He had adopted her. And it says that this Mordecai was the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem when the captives were carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah. Jeconiah was sent into exile in 597 BC. And that doesn't mean that Mordecai went with him. If that was so, Mordecai would be probably 125 years old. It probably means that Zedekiah's grandfather or his great-grandfather went with the captives out of Babylon, out of Judah to Babylon in 597. That means that Mordecai, as we begin to see who he is in his character, had heard the stories of what God had done. About Judah's unfaithfulness, about God's judgment on them, about how God had cared for them, kept them secure in captivity in Babylon, had made his presence known through those that he raised up. Daniel wouldn't eat the king's dainties. Not going to do it. Throw me in the lion's den. They did. But the lions couldn't open their mouths. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, turn that furnace up tenfold. And they did. Got a burn smell on it. The point is that God's presence during these times that there was no hope, exile, was through raising up his servants, his people, to be the force. Happens right here in Esther. And Mordecai had heard the stories. It doesn't say that, but when we see his character and what he does here, he would have to have heard the stories of Jehovah and his presence among his people. He adopted his orphan cousin Esther in verses 7 and 8. It says that Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king, 7 and 8. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. And when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken among the king's palace. Esther is captured too. She's brought in to the king's palace, and she's under the care and the tutelage of Haggai. She's captured with the rest of the beautiful young women. Where's God in all this? Don't you think you'd have to ask that? What's going to happen to me? I was minding my own business. I was doing my own thing. Now all of a sudden I'm captive in the king's palace. And then enters Haggai. Let's talk about Haggai for just a minute. He becomes Esther's mentor. The religion of Persia at this time was Zoroastrianism. Cyrus the Great was a Zoroastrianism worshiper. Zoroastrianism had one god. His name was Ahura Mazda. The prophet was Zoroaster. It was an early form of Hinduism. And the things, without going into great detail, the things that Zoroastrianism believed or promoted was that ultimately good overcame evil. Human beings are innately free. Religion guides to the truth. It doesn't force a belief. It focused on good thoughts, good words, good deeds. You must have seen these very things in Esther. I'm assuming that Haggai was a worshiper of Zoroastrianism. I'm going to make a point here because it's about God in the shadows. Haggai didn't know that Esther was a Jew. Mordecai said, don't tell her. He had his reasons. The time would come when she would tell him, but she hadn't told him anything yet. I want us to understand God working in the shadows of people that see in us God's presence. They don't see God. And I'll take a little liberty and talk about some personal things that have happened to me. About 100 people in our office. They called me Reverend. I never told anybody in that office, I'm a Christian. Never said it. They called me Rev, not ridiculing me. counseled a lot of people. My presence bolstered many situations. Think that that's exactly what's going on here. Haggai saw in Esther things that he knew were of value. And you see, we need to see that when we walk out into this world. We know God is walking with us, in us, over us, in the shadows, however you want to say it. People see it. My Bible says that's so. You know, I remember challenge, work schedule, family, all of those life things. And I remember 2011 when Rob and I were put up to be elders. I can remember saying to Rob, I can't do this. I work 50, 55 hours a week, every week. He said, so what? Because it's God's purpose, his direction in our lives that is a lesson investment. God never leaves. He always provides a way. I just have to show up. And that's all Esther did, show up. You know, to put it in a colloquial term, she was just some really nice young lady from the lower south side of Caesar. Right? So God in your life is God in the shadows. Is it God in your life is God in the shadows. And so then in verse 10, Mordecai instructs her and says, look, Esther, Esther's not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. As it turns out, Haggai had taken her on. He was mentoring her. Because somehow in Haggai, what he saw in her, he knew that this young woman needed to be a queen of Persia. He couldn't have told you why or what. He just knew that she needed to be placed in a position where Ahasuerus and Xerxes could meet her. He says, don't tell them who you are. Sometimes faith needs to be turned over to God in the shadows. Sometimes the world around us needs to feel the explosion of God in the shadows in this life by the decisions I make, the spirit that I have, by the service that I provide, and by my presence in front of Almighty God. Would you agree with that? Yeah. That's God in the shadows. I don't know how that works. I've never seen a list of the 10 most important points. I have seen the statement that says show up and let God have it. So she, in verse 15, says again that Esther was winning favor in all the eyes that saw her. In 15 to 17, 16, it says, and when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. She becomes a queen, but she continues to not reveal that she's a Jew. In verses 19 to 23, Mordecai finds out that there's what do you call it, somebody's going to kill Ahasuerus. There's a plot to kill Xerxes. Two guys, he overhears it. So he funnels the news to Esther. Esther tells Xerxes, and Xerxes deals with these two guys. And it says that this was written down in the Chronicles of the King. At this point, we don't know why that's so important. As we go on, we'll find out that that writing of what happened and that Mordecai had done it was recorded in the Chronicles of the King will become a significant piece of God working in the shadows. Let me explain it. So just a bit of a preview or a ticker, if you will, as we go on, it would seem that things would really get to be fun, get to be good, get to be a blessing at this point. But enter that person that we all know enters at the wrong time. About the time I thought I had things straightened out, got my work figured out, got my schedule done, had things so I could do all that I needed to do for God, my world was turned upside down. Somebody else came in, somebody else was hired, somebody else came in as an advisor. I couldn't do what I was going to do. Had all good intentions, but couldn't do it because of that person or that circumstance. Ever happened to you? And so Haman, with all power and in his presence, would kill everything that we think is going to happen. But God is in the shadows. So in conclusion, what's your story? Where are you right now? Living on the south side of Susa. What door has God opened in front of you? You don't know what it means. You don't know how it works. You may just be seeing a crack. Will you walk through it? Work, family, profession, assets, experiences, troubles, education. What's your story? See, God's purpose in this world is his work in the local church. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11 to 13. The fulfillment of the ages is this fellowship. We'll find out that Esther understands that very, very clearly through Mordecai. Mordecai will put her on the line. That's really not a line. It's just trusting God. God is working in our lives day in, day out. And however you want to say it, God in the shadows. It's just his presence. And I know I'm not. We need to rise up with that conviction in our lives. Live life the way God has put it before us. Oh, it's going to take what we're learning in Esther. Because it's not about who we're not. It's about who we are. May God richly bless us in this journey, in this study. If you have any need today, if you have a question, if you want to know more about what it means to be part of God's church, Let's get together and visit. Let's talk through these things. All for the purpose of God and His glory. In the light that He's given us, where He's placed us, in the door that He's opened. To Him be the glory.